What happens when a woman invests $400,000 into her husband's dream, only to find out the grand opening happened 6 weeks ago without her? When she finally asks about it, the answer doesn't come from her husband. It comes from his secretary calmly explaining that only close family and friends were invited. And then just days later, the husband calls not to apologize, not to explain, but to ask why the bills are overdue and where the money is. There's a simple truth in both business and marriage: where there is no transparency, there will always be control. When someone is excluded from the decisions but still expected to fund the vision, the real question isn't about money, it's about respect. So when respect quietly disappears, should silence protect the relationship or destroy it? Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're tuning in from. It's always amazing to see where our stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next twist in this journey. Now, let's listen to her from the heart. I begin this story on a late October afternoon in Naperville when the maple tree in our backyard had turned completely red, and I still believed I was part of the dream I had invested $400,000 to build. My name is Zafira Lennox. I'm 44 years old, and for most of my career I worked in operations management. I understand spreadsheets, compliance contracts, signatures, and the quiet discipline of documentation. I understand that numbers tell stories long before people are willing to. For nearly 2 years, I had been transferring money into Cedar Line Rehab and Wellness, my husband Gideon Vale's dream clinic in Lincoln Park. The $400,000 didn't leave my account in one dramatic swoop. It moved in phases: build-out costs, equipment deposits, leasehold improvements, payroll buffer. Each transfer felt like a vote of confidence. Each wire confirmation felt like a brick laid in a future we were building together. There was no formal contract between us, no operating agreement with my name printed in bold, just a thread of emails where Gideon referred to my contribution as a family investment. In those emails, he promised I would be treated as a silent partner, no interest, no rigid repayment schedule, but full transparency on major milestones. His words, not mine. For the first year, he kept that promise. Every Sunday, like clockwork, he called. He'd walk me through progress updates as if I were sitting beside him. New flooring installed, treatment tables delivered, permits approved, the first hire. He would send pictures from the construction site, dust on his jeans, excitement in his eyes. I believed him. I believed in him. Then Safi Rowe entered the picture. She came in under the title of office manager. Gideon described her as exactly what we need to make this place professional: organized, assertive, experienced. After she started, the Sunday calls grew shorter, then irregular, then replaced by quick texts, and eventually those texts stopped too. What I continued to receive, however, were forwarded invoices. That Tuesday afternoon in late October, I called the clinic because something had been bothering me for weeks. Gideon hadn't mentioned a grand opening date, not once, and the closer we got to the end of the year, the stranger that silence felt. Safi answered on the first ring. "Did you get the invoice I forwarded?" she asked. No hello, no acknowledgement of who I was, just the invoice. I told her I had received it. "Good," she said. "Payment needs to go out by Friday." I paused. Then I asked the question I had called to ask in the first place. When did the clinic open? There was no hesitation in her voice. 6 weeks ago. We only invited close family and friends. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. 6 weeks ago. Close family and friends. I am Gideon's legal wife. I am the person who wired $400,000 into that business. And yet I had not been invited. I had not been told. I had not even known the date. The feeling wasn't just embarrassment. It wasn't even anger at first. It was disorientation, as if I had been edited out of a story I had funded. I didn't argue with her. I didn't accuse her. I simply thanked her for the information and hung up. I stood in my kitchen afterward, phone still in my hand, staring out at that red maple tree. The leaves were almost painfully bright against the gray sky. For 2 years, I had believed I was building something with my husband. Now I had to ask myself a different question in the actual power structure of Cedar Line. Where exactly did I stand? Because if I wasn't considered close family at the grand opening, then I wasn't just excluded from an event. I had been repositioned, and no one had asked my consent before drawing that line. I didn't confront Gideon that night. I didn't send an emotional text. I didn't demand an explanation over the phone. 2 days later, I drove into Chicago. The wind off Lake Michigan had that early winter edge to it. I took Lakeshore Drive and kept the radio off. I needed quiet, not drama, not a fight, just confirmation. Cedar Line Rehab and Wellness sat on a clean stretch of Lincoln Park brick facades, boutique storefronts, high-end coffee shops within walking distance. It was exactly the kind of neighborhood Gideon had wanted: affluent, professional, visible. I parked half a block away. I walked slowly toward the entrance. Through the large glass windows, I could see the reception desk. A woman I didn't recognize was typing at the computer. 2 patients sat in the waiting area with clipboards resting on their knees. A therapist guided someone down the hallway toward a treatment room. This was not a place preparing to open. This was a place already operating. I stepped closer to the door but didn't touch the handle. The signage above the entrance wasn't freshly installed. There was a faint water streak beneath one of the letters, the kind that forms after several rains. The potted plants near the window had grown past their initial arrangements. On the side table in the waiting area, I could make out last month's magazines. Everything I saw confirmed what Safi had said. 6 weeks. At least. This was not a soft opening that had just happened. This was a business already in rhythm. I did not walk inside. I knew if Safi saw me, she would recalibrate the narrative. She would explain. She would smooth. And I wasn't ready for that. I wanted clean data before conversation. Back in my car, I called Gideon. Voicemail. I waited a few minutes and called again. Voicemail. That evening, I tried once more. Voicemail. The man who once called me every Sunday without fail was now sending me to voicemail. And yet his office manager had picked up immediately when I called the clinic. That wasn't busyness. That was filtration. I sat in my driveway long after I returned to Naperville, hands resting on the steering wheel, replaying the pattern in my mind. Information flowed through Safi. Payments flowed through me. Gideon sat somewhere between the two. 3 days later, he called. His voice was tight. The bills are overdue. Did you send the money? Not I'm sorry. Not, we need to talk. Not I should have told you. Just the bills. For the first time since this started, I smiled, not because I was amused, not because I was vindictive, but because I finally understood the leverage. When I was silent and paying, I was peripheral. When I paused the money, I became urgent. I'm reviewing everything I told him calmly. I'll send the funds, but this time I need to see exactly what I'm paying for. There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line. He exhaled. What does that mean? It means, I said evenly, I need a full picture. I ended the call knowing something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer about a missed invitation. It was about access. It was about control of information. And for the first time, I could see the outline of the structure clearly enough to begin asking the right questions. I spread everything across the dining room table the way I used to prepare for internal audits back when I still worked in operations. Clean surface, ordered stacks, no distractions. If there was a pattern, I would find it. My laptop sat open in front of me. I logged into my banking portal and pulled up 2 full years of transfers. One by one, I matched outgoing wires to invoice dates, construction deposits, equipment purchases, leasehold improvements, payroll reserves. Each transaction had once felt purposeful. Now I looked at them as data points instead of gestures of trust. I printed every email exchange between Gideon and me related to Cedar Line. The early messages were filled with optimism. We're almost there. The build-out is ahead of schedule. I couldn't do this without you. He referred to my contribution as an investment under family terms. No formal interest, no rigid repayment schedule. But he made one thing clear. In writing, I would be informed of major milestones, including the official opening. That phrase sat in front of me in black ink. Major milestones. The clinic had opened 6 weeks ago. By any reasonable definition, that was a major milestone. Either the promise in those emails meant nothing, or I had been deliberately removed from the flow of information. I moved to the invoices Safi had forwarded over the last year. They were always attachments, never originals sent directly from vendors. I noticed that pattern for the first time. Everything filtered, everything passing through one inbox before reaching mine. Then I began tracking recurring expenses. There it was, a line item labeled consulting fee. The amount wasn't dramatic on its own, not enough to trigger alarm if you glanced at a single month, but it appeared again and again. 11 consecutive months. Same amount. Same receiving entity. Steady as a heartbeat. I highlighted it. Then I noticed another category: business development. Less consistent, but substantial. And a few equipment charges I didn't remember discussing in detail. I remembered broad conversations about buying ultrasound machines and therapy tables. I did not remember signing off on specific vendors at those price points. That was when the realization settled in. My money wasn't just building the clinic, it was operating it. And I had no visibility into the structure of that operation. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment. This wasn't about hurt anymore. It wasn't about a missed invitation. It was about governance, about oversight, about whether I had been positioned as a partner or simply a funding source. I called Noelle Hartman the next morning. She's a commercial contracts attorney. We've known each other since college. She doesn't overreact and she doesn't indulge emotion when structure is the real issue. I summarized everything for her: the investment, the lack of a formal agreement, the grand opening I wasn't invited to, the recurring consulting fee. She didn't ask how I felt. She asked, who owns the company receiving that consulting fee? I looked down at my spreadsheet. I don't know. Find out, she said. That's where this gets interesting. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. For the first time since this started, my focus shifted completely. I wasn't asking whether Gideon had hurt me. I was asking who benefited from the financial structure behind Cedarline. That afternoon, I reached out to a retired bookkeeper named Darlene Price. She came highly recommended by a former colleague of mine. Independent, methodical, uninterested in drama. I told her I needed a full review of all contributions and expenditures connected to Cedarline. I didn't need commentary. I needed clarity. When I ended that call, something inside me felt steadier. I wasn't looking for an apology anymore. I was looking for the truth. 2 weeks later, Darlene sat across from me at the same dining room table, a neat stack of papers in her hands and an Excel summary open on her tablet. By then, I had already moved past instinct. Everything was evidence. I had given her full access to the bank records transfer confirmations, every invoice Safi had forwarded, and the entire email chain between Gideon and me. I asked her for 3 things: total amount contributed, total amount spent, and a breakdown of any expenditures that lacked written acknowledgement from me. She slid the 4-page report toward me. Start here, she said, tapping one section: consulting fee. The same entity appeared month after month. The payments had begun shortly after the lease for the Lincoln Park location became effective. 11 months of steady transfers. When added together, the total was no longer modest. It was a figure large enough to matter. Who is this company? I asked. I pulled public records, she replied. It's an LLC registered in Illinois, not directly tied to Cedarline. I opened my laptop and navigated to the Illinois Secretary of State's business search. The registered agent was listed, Bree Rowe. The last name caught my attention immediately. Rowe, Safi Rowe. I searched further: address history, corporate filings, cross-reference social media. It didn't take long to confirm that Bree Rowe was Safi's older sister. The consulting fee wasn't going to a neutral third-party strategist. It was going to the family of the woman controlling the office. The invoice descriptions were vague: strategic growth support, operational advisory. There were no attached reports outlining deliverables, no measurable performance summaries, no formal consulting agreement in the files Darlene reviewed. The money flowed consistently, predictably, like payroll. I felt my jaw tighten, but I forced myself to stay measured. Darlene turned the page. There's more. 2 high-ticket equipment purchases stood out. Therapy systems sourced through a vendor I didn't recognize. I compared the invoice prices to publicly listed market rates. The markup wasn't astronomical, but it was noticeable. Enough to raise a question. I later learned that the vendor had a long-standing professional relationship with Safi. The pattern was no longer accidental. Funds from my investment were moving outward through channels tied to the same individual who filtered every invoice before it reached me. I still didn't know how much Gideon understood. That question sat heavier than the numbers. Was he negligent, trusting, complicit, overwhelmed, or simply signing whatever was placed in front of him because he wanted to focus on patients and leave administrative matters to someone else I didn't call him? Instead, I contacted Noelle again. There's another thing I need you to look at, I told her. The lease. If Cedarline was structured loosely, if consulting payments were flowing to family members of the office manager, I needed to understand the legal risk attached to the physical space itself. Noelle requested a copy of the lease through a legitimate channel connected to the property manager. When she called me back, her tone was different. Zephyra, she said carefully, the lease includes a personal guarantee. In whose name? Gideon's. Only Gideon's. That meant if Cedarline failed to meet its obligations, he was personally liable, not shielded by a corporate entity, not protected by shared responsibility. While money was flowing out through consulting arrangements tied to Safi's family, my husband's personal assets were exposed. I sat very still after that call. The risk wasn't centered on me. It was sitting squarely on Gideon's shoulders, and the structure around him had been built in a way that gave someone else unusual influence over both information and cash flow. For the first time, my anger shifted shape. This wasn't just about exclusion, it was about a system, and I needed to see every part of it before I stepped back into that office again. By the time I walked into Noelle's office again, this no longer felt like a marital misunderstanding. It felt structural. Her office overlooked a quiet stretch of downtown Chicago muted glass and clean lines, the kind of place where decisions are made on paper, not emotion. I handed her the copy of the lease she had legally obtained through the property broker. She flipped through it slowly, methodically, the way she reads everything. No assumptions, no shortcuts. It's standard commercial language, she said at first. Base rent escalation clauses, maintenance obligations. Then she stopped. Here. She turned the document toward me and tapped the paragraph. Personal guarantee. It was written plainly. Gideon Vale individually and not in any representative capacity guarantees performance of all lease obligations. Only Gideon's name, not mine, not Cedarline as a shielded corporate entity in any meaningful protective sense. If the clinic defaulted on rent, if revenue fell short, if operating cash dried up, my husband's personal assets could be pursued. I sat back in my chair and read the clause again. There was no ambiguity. This wasn't structured with liability protection in mind. Noelle said carefully, if things go south, he's exposed. I felt something shift inside me. My anger had been sharp and clean until that moment. Now it blurred into something more complicated. I opened my laptop and pulled up my spreadsheet. I aligned dates, lease effective date, consulting fee first payment. They were nearly identical. The consulting payments began almost immediately after the lease became active, which meant that during the period when Gideon's personal financial exposure was at its highest, money was simultaneously flowing out of the business to an LLC tied to his office manager's sister. I stared at the numbers until they stopped feeling abstract. I had originally been furious because I wasn't invited to the grand opening. Now I was looking at something larger. Either my husband had allowed this structure knowingly, or he had signed off on decisions he didn't fully understand. Neither possibility was comforting. I went home that evening and did something I had avoided doing before. I reviewed message logs, not by prying into locked devices. I simply went through business-related email chains and text notifications that had crossed my phone when Gideon and I were sitting next to each other in the evenings. There were late-night exchanges between Gideon and Safi about vendor adjustments, staffing, quick approvals. The language wasn't overtly inappropriate. There were no declarations, no explicit lines crossed, but there was familiarity. She often replied on his behalf to vendors before he had a chance to respond. She answered strategic questions as if she held final authority. And every large invoice I had received over the past year had one thing in common: it had been forwarded to me by Safi. Never directly from the source, never copied simultaneously to me in real time. All financial communication flowed through one gatekeeper. I felt my pulse slow instead of accelerate. This wasn't chaos, it was centralized control. Sunday morning, I called Gideon. He answered on the fourth ring. "Hey," he said, cautious. "I'm coming to the clinic Tuesday afternoon," I told him evenly. "I want you there. And I want Safi there." There was a pause on the line, long enough to register. "What's this about?" he asked. "Everything I said. And I'm not asking permission." His voice dropped slightly. "Okay." That single word carried more hesitation than agreement. After we hung up, I assembled my file. Darlene's 4-page report. The Illinois Secretary of State registration for Bree Rose, LLC. The lease clause highlighting personal guarantee. A list of expenditures exceeding $5,000. Copies of the invoices I had been sent. I organized them into a clean binder. The last time I drove to Lincoln Park, I stood outside the glass and watched from a distance. This time, I would walk through the door, and I would not be walking in as a hurt wife. I would be walking in as a capital partner who had been denied oversight. The back office of Cedar Lane felt colder than the treatment rooms. Fluorescent lights, white walls, a desk too small for 3 people. No patients, no staff, no performance, just Gideon, Safi, and me. I placed the binder on the desk and opened it without preamble. "I'm going to start with this," I said, sliding Darlene's report forward. "Bree Rowe." "Who is she?" Safi answered first. "She's my sister. She provides strategic growth support. I recommended her early on. Is there a written consulting agreement?" I asked. "We discussed terms verbally," she replied. "Is there documentation of services delivered, reports analysis, performance metrics?" Silence. Gideon shifted in his chair. "I knew we had someone helping with growth planning," he said. "I didn't track the monthly number. The monthly number was consistent for 11 months, I said calmly. Consistent enough to total tens of thousands of dollars. Safi straightened slightly. It was necessary to position us competitively. Then there should be records supporting that necessity. She didn't produce any. I moved to the next tab in the binder. The lease, I said, and read aloud the personal guarantee clause. "Did you know I asked Gideon directly that if Cedar Line fails to meet its lease obligations, you are personally liable?" He blinked. "I thought we structured it through the company," he said. "You didn't," I replied. He ran a hand over his face. I watched the realization move across him in real time. He had signed. He had trusted. He had not fully absorbed. Safi attempted to redirect the conversation. "We're projecting strong growth next quarter," she said. "Occupancy is increasing. I'm not questioning projections," I said. "I'm questioning structure." I turned another page. "These 2 equipment purchases," I continued, "marked up above current market rates, approved on dates when I was out of state. The confirmation email includes only the 2 of you." Gideon looked at Safi. She responded. "Those were time-sensitive decisions. Time-sensitive decisions still require transparency," I said. The room tightened. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since that phone call 6 weeks ago. "Why wasn't I invited to the grand opening?" Safi answered quickly. "Gideon wanted to keep it low pressure." Gideon frowned. "I thought you knew." I assumed. "There is no email invitation," I said quietly. "No message, no calendar invite, nothing." The silence that followed was heavier than the numbers we had been discussing. I closed the binder halfway and folded my hands. This is what happens next, I said. 1. I want a full accounting prepared by an independent accounting firm, not internal staff. 2. I want a repayment plan for the consulting fees, paid without a written contract or documented deliverables. 3. Any expenditure over $5,000 requires my written acknowledgement going forward. I paused. And 4. All vendor invoices must be sent directly to me. No more filtering. Safi's expression tightened. Gideon looked between us, no longer defensive, but unsettled. I stood up. I am not here to destroy this business, I said. I am here to protect my investment and your exposure. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam the door. I walked out through the same glass entrance I had once stood outside of. But this time, I wasn't looking in from the sidewalk. I had stepped into the center of the structure, and no one in that building could pretend I didn't belong there. The 2 weeks after that meeting were quieter than anything that had come before and somehow heavier. Silence, when it's deliberate, has weight. I did not text Gideon to follow up. I did not ask Safi for status updates. I did not transfer another dollar. If Cedarline needed funding, it would have to function within the boundaries I had set. I opened a separate account at my bank and labeled it in my system as Cedarline repayment. If money began to come back, it would be tracked cleanly. No commingling, no ambiguity. I asked Noelle to prepare a preliminary legal framework in case I needed to formalize my position through the courts. I wasn't threatening litigation. I was preparing for it the way I prepare for any operational risk, by assuming it could become real. 1 week after the confrontation, an email arrived. From Safi, KPMG is compiling the numbers. We will respond soon, not from the accounting firm directly, not CC'd from an independent source, from her. Even after being explicitly told to step aside from financial control, she was still inserting herself as the intermediary. I didn't respond. 2 days later, my phone rang with a Chicago area code I didn't recognize. It was a representative from a medical equipment supplier. They were following up on a delayed payment. I've requested all invoices be sent directly to me, I said evenly. Please resend the original documentation to my email. There was a pause on the other end. We've always worked through the office manager, the representative said. That's our contact. I understood then how complete the filtration had been. I hadn't simply been uninformed about the opening. I had been structurally removed from the operational chain. That evening, Gideon called. His voice carried strain. Revenue hasn't ramped up as fast as we projected, he said. The first 3 months were tighter than expected. He explained patient volume, insurance reimbursement delays, cash flow compression, and the pause on funding is making it harder, he added carefully. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "This isn't about punishment. It's about structure." He exhaled. Then I asked the question that had been sitting under everything else. Is there anything between you and Safi outside of work silence? No, he said finally. But he didn't sound indignant. He sounded cornered. I trusted her to manage things, he continued. I needed someone who could handle operations. Trust and control are not the same thing, I replied. He didn't argue. At the end of the second week, a new email arrived. This time it came directly from an independent accounting firm. Attached was a formal accounting of all Cedarline expenditures to date. The report confirmed what Darlene had already uncovered. The full amount of consulting fees paid to Bree Rose LLC. The absence of a signed consulting agreement in the clinic's files. No documented deliverables. There was no dramatic language in the report, just facts. Attached to it was a proposed repayment plan, 18 months, equal installments, beginning the first of the following month. I forwarded everything to Noelle immediately. We reviewed every line together. They wouldn't propose repayment unless they understood the weakness in their position, she said. This is acknowledgement. That night, something else happened. An internal email thread due to the new direct CC protocol I had required landed in my inbox. It wasn't meant for me. In it, Safi referenced adjusting the narrative with Zephyra to avoid escalation. I read the sentence 3 times. Narrative. Not discussion, not clarification, narrative. I wasn't a partner to be informed. I was a variable to be managed. Any remaining doubt evaporated. If I didn't establish control now, I would spend the next decade funding a structure that strategically minimized me. The next morning, I responded formally. I agreed to the 18-month repayment plan. But attached to my acceptance was an addendum drafted by Noel. It required a clearly defined financial transparency protocol. Dual written approval for any expenditure over $5,000. Direct access to Cedarline's accounting software in read-only form. Quarterly financial summaries prepared by an external firm. And one final condition: the role of office manager would be subject to review by an outside advisory consultant within 60 days. I was no longer reacting. I was restructuring. The first repayment arrived on the first day of the following month. It appeared in the separate account I had created exactly as scheduled. No delays, no partial transfers. For the first time in months, the numbers moved in a direction that reflected accountability. Invoices began arriving directly in my inbox from vendors. Clean PDFs, no forwarding, no commentary layered on top. I logged into Cedarline's accounting platform with the credentials provided. I didn't interfere with day-to-day entries. I observed revenue expenses, receivables. It wasn't about control for its own sake. It was about visibility. A month after the addendum went into effect, Safi submitted her resignation. Officially, she was pursuing another professional opportunity. Unofficially, the centralized power she had held no longer existed. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. The structure had shifted. Gideon and I began having longer conversations again, not about romance, not about image, about operations. One evening, sitting across from me at the kitchen table in Naperville, he admitted something plainly. "I sign things without reading them carefully," he said. "I assumed we were protected. I assumed she had it handled." He paused. "I didn't want to disappoint you if things got complicated." I looked at him steadily. "The biggest damage wasn't the money," I said. "It was being excluded from the opening. It was being treated like a funding source instead of a partner." He nodded slowly. He didn't defend himself. He began doing something more meaningful than apologizing. Before signing a purchase order for new therapy equipment, he called me. Before adjusting staffing budgets, he sent projections. When the advisory review of operational roles was completed, he shared the full report with me. There are things I will probably never know. I will never know the exact nature of every late-night message. I will never know whether Safi's influence crossed lines that were never documented. But I do know the environment that allowed secrecy to thrive no longer exists. Near the end of the year, I drove to Cedarline after hours. The lights in the treatment rooms were off. The reception desk was dark. Gideon was waiting in the staff kitchen with takeout containers from a restaurant down the block. There was no ribbon cutting for me, no applause, no speeches, just 2 folding chairs and a quiet room. He looked at me and said, "This place wouldn't exist without you." Not just the money, the accountability, the insistence on structure. I didn't dismantle my marriage. I didn't shut down the clinic. I did something far less dramatic and far more enduring. I required contracts. I required signatures. I required transparency. Love does not replace governance. Trust does not eliminate responsibility. And if I invested $400,000 into a dream, I have the right to stand inside its light, not outside the glass, watching it operate without me. Maybe the real lesson here was never about the money. It was about standing up without burning everything down. It was about choosing clarity over silence and choosing respect over resentment. In the end, we learned that love doesn't replace structure, and trust doesn't mean turning away from hard conversations. Sometimes the most powerful change doesn't come from shouting, it comes from staying at the table long enough to be heard. If this story felt familiar in any way, we hope it reminds us that boundaries and kindness can exist at the same time. Growth inside a family isn't always dramatic. Often it's quiet, often it's uncomfortable, but it can still lead somewhere better. If you'd like to be part of this space where stories are shared honestly and listened to with care, consider subscribing. And if you want to leave a few lines in the comments about what stayed with you, we read them and they matter more than you think. Thank you for spending this time with us. Wherever you're listening from, we're glad you're here. Until next time, take care of yourselves and of each other.